Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some cards with white pigment on black cardstock. And in this case, I'm going to use black mixed media heavy stock. I'm using the new 3D Botanicals collection from Spellbinders. They sent them over to create with and share with you. And I have already done a video with this collection. Most of those I did different techniques with kind of the blackout method, where you use black ink on your embossing folder and you press it down onto a lighter colored cardstock and it blacks out the background. So this is kind of the opposite of that. The first thing I want to do is to just do my initial emboss with my embossing folder. Now these embossing folders have 3 different images in them, as well as dies to cut them out. So the one that I'm using right now is called the Floral for You 3D embossing folder. And I like to do my technique first without using the dies. So I use just the embossing folder so that I can really put this through several times and make sure that I have my backgrounds exactly how I want them to before I add in the dies and cut them out. So I do like to tape everything in place. I did my initial emboss where I misted both sides of the cardstock with water, put it through, and then took it out of the embossing folder for it to completely dry before starting this next step. Then I put that embossing or that embossed paper back in the folder, taped it in place, and it kind of locks into place. It's really easy to place back into the folder. And then after it was taped in place, I took a white pigment pad on the opposite side and I inked it. Now, when you do this, you want to make sure that you're taping your paper where the details are pressed out and you're putting your ink where it's pretty much flat and all of the details are indented. So you're getting that ink on the background of your cardstock. And I'm going to do this 3 times just to build that ink up. With this pigment ink, it does cover the background quite well, but you do need to kind of build that color up, and you can do this as many times as you want. I did 3 times and I liked the look of that background. The ink is still going to dry and go into the cardstock a little bit. So it's not bright white, but if you wanted it to be a brighter white, you could keep layering on your ink. I do like to heat set my ink after I have it on there, just to make sure that when I go to work on my next step, it's not going to interfere with that ink. So I just placed those dies in there, and there's a little groove in there for those dies to fit. So it fits in very, very easily and very well and makes it really easy to know exactly where they go. And then you can just pop out those pieces. I will untape all the rest of it afterwards. So like I said before, this creates 3 different pieces. 2 of them are good for elements on the card. The third one has a hole in it and is good for creating a tag. So that's what I'm going to be doing. I'll be creating 2 different cards as well as a tag with each of the techniques. I'm going to do this Floral for You with one technique, and then I'm going to use the Mushrooms from Me to You, which is another 3D embossing folder in this set, and I'm going to do a different technique or different inks with those. So I'm taking my embossing tool and I am heat setting that back. And the one thing about heat setting it is you need to do it for longer than you think. I tend to be bad at not doing it for long enough because I get a little bit impatient. The other thing you can do is just let it dry completely. For this first one, I'm going to be using some Cloud9 interference inks on my background. Now, I've done many videos with these inks. There's a whole playlist with them. And what I love about them is each ink pad has a different look on light cardstock than it does on dark cardstock. So the color on the left of the cover is the color you're going to see on white cardstock. The color on the right of the cover is the color you're going to see on black cardstock. And I thought this would be fun to have this white pigment ink on the background and then do these colors over top, because you're going to be seeing little bits of both of those colors on that background. And the beautiful thing is the color on the dark cardstock or on the black has some interference properties or some shimmer to it, which makes it appear on the black. So once this is all dried and set, once the ink is completely set, if you tilt it in the light, you get some beautiful shine and beautiful shimmer from it. So I am going to do several coats of this ink. You'll notice as it dries, it kind of just seeps into the white pigment ink and it dulls a little bit. It gets a little bit chalky, which is totally fine. I was expecting that, but I do build up that ink a couple times. So I ink all of them, let it dry for a few minutes, and then ink them again just to kind of get extra color on there. I'm using different ink blending brushes with each one of these. Some of them have detailed ink blending brushes. Some have just regular ink blending brushes. Just depends on what I have for each pad. I like to have one or an ink blending brush for each pad, and I label it to make sure that I know which one goes with which pads. You can easily rinse these brushes off and then just use them with whatever pad, but I personally like to have one dedicated for each one. And so I just have them labeled because each of those pads have a different color for the light and a different color for the dark. Personally, I don't like to mix them. You could probably wipe off the excess ink and just use them with whatever ink pad you want. I just don't really like to do that. So I'm going to keep ink blending here and building up that color. And then I'm going to let it sit and dry for a little bit and see how it looks. And if I like the look of it, I'll start assembling my cards. If not, I will just build up that ink even more. So just know you can do many layers of that ink. You don't have to get them all done in one shot. Because we used mixed media heavy stock for this, it can handle being ink blended on, it can handle moisture, it can handle whatever we throw at it. So why not? Now, the thing I love about this mixed media heavy stock, as well as the fact that it can handle moisture, it can handle lots of ink, it can handle lots of playing with, is it has a gorgeous velvet look to it when you just die cut it. You kind of lose that look to it when you're doing inks and stuff like that on it, but I have something that I'm going to be die cutting to put in front of this that I'm going to be using that same mixed media heavy stock on, and because of that velvet look, it's really striking when I place it on in front of these pieces here. So you can see how I'm going back and forth between the different ink pads, adding more ink to different areas, ink blending things or blending the different colors in with each other. I want to make sure to have a good representation of the different colors. And because the colors kind of mute and seep into the cardstock a little bit, you can notice that after a few minutes, the yellow is not quite as bright. So by adding extra layers, it just deepens that a little bit more and brightens that color up a little bit. I don't necessarily want these colors to be super vibrant, and because they start seeping into the cardstock and into that pigment ink and kind of mute a little bit, I know that they won't stay like that, but by building them up, I'm going to be able to see a little bit more of each of those colors. So as soon as I have the look that I like, I'm going to let that completely dry, and here they are completely dried. And you can see how those colors have toned down a little bit, but you do still see each of the individual colors to them. Off screen, I die cut some mats for each one of them, and for this particular one, I'm using the Essential Arches die set. It coordinates beautifully with the arches from the embossing folder, and I love the fact that little pieces of the flowers are stuck out of the embossing folder, so you're gonna not have a perfect arch, you're gonna have little bits out of it. I love that type of look. So I'm using the Cloud9 interference ink to color my mats here. So this one here I'm using is Summer Garden. I realized I didn't say what colors I was using here. This one is Summer Garden. The one with the yellow and coral is Sweet Treat. Tropical Paradise was the one that had the pink and the bluey purpley color, and then Peacock Tails had blue and purple. By using that interference pad, I can coordinate my mats to work perfectly with my colored images. And that's just a little trick I like to do to coordinate different pieces with these interference ink pads. Because of their colors and because of their uniqueness, they're hard to find cardstocks, in my opinion, to match them. So by just using white or black cardstock and inking them around the edges, and I don't need to ink the entire thing because the center part is completely covered, I can make sure that my mats coordinate perfectly. And they also have that interference shimmer that these pads have, so it just blends in beautifully. So I'm using some Barely Art Glue and a fine line bottle to glue everything in place. I can put as much or as little glue as I need. And this is the little kitty cat die, and this is the die that I'm going to use. I thought these would look really, really cute sitting in front of these ink blended backgrounds. So these are die cut out of that black mixed media heavy stock. So they just have a beautiful velvet look to them. And actually when you feel them, the cardstock feels like velvet as well. Now in my other video using these embossing folders, I used some other embossing folders to do more detail in the background. For these particular cards, I wanted the focus to be on these images and these embossed pieces. So I kept my backgrounds of my cards white and plain so that that focus is just on these images and these focal points of the card. I also haven't put any sentiments on them. Those I typically like to put on when I know what I'm going to be using the card for, so I'm leaving them off here. I have some gems here. These are beautiful new gems from Spellbinders. This one here is the smoky topaz, and I thought it would look nice as little stars in the sky. It's kind of a dark yellow color, but they come in 4 different sizes of those gems. So I like the fact that you can pick and choose which size works best for whatever you're using them for. For this particular use, I'm using the tiniest ones. But I love the fact that you have different choices with different colors. And the easiest way I've found to put those tiny ones on is just to use a die pick, kind of pick it into the adhesive behind it, and then place it on your piece where you want it, and then just use your other finger from your other hand to press it into place. So for my second card here, I forgot that I wanted to use one of the ink pads on my mat, so I accidentally glued down that black one. Easy enough to take it off because my glue hadn't completely set, so I can take that and ink blend it. So this one here was the Peacock tails that I'm putting on here. Once I have that ink blended, and you can see how much of a difference those colors on that background look, I can clean up my space and then I can start gluing them back in place. So that's one reason why I love this liquid glue, is you have time to shimmy things and move things in place. It does start to grab fairly quickly because you can see how it grabbed some of that black cardstock as well, but it hadn't completely set. So it was easy enough to pick that off without ruining my card base and correct the mistake that I had made. So these 3D embossed backgrounds and elements have a lot of detail in them and a lot of dimension to them. So when I'm gluing those in place, I like to be fairly liberal with that glue. I want to make sure that there are lots of areas that are lower, that touch my card base, that are going to be glued down. So I want to make sure to have glue on a lot of areas so that I can make sure that it's nice and secure. I glued my cat silhouette in place, and for this one I'm going to use the berry gems. These ones have a pink tone to them, so they work perfectly for the different colors in this card. And once again, I'm using the smallest ones for this card. You could use the different sizes if you wanted, but I didn't want these to be the focal point. I wanted them to just be something unexpected in the background, so I just used the tiny ones. For the tag here, I'm using my score pal and just scoring at the top of one of my mats. I did a few different layers of mats here, and then that largest one I did twice, so that one could be the back side of it and the other could be just the top adhered to my tag, so you could write a message on this in the center of it. Now I did all 3 of these pieces with the same technique, but you don't necessarily have to. You can do variations of different techniques with all 3 of them. It's just easy enough when you have one piece of cardstock in that embossing folder to do all 3 with that same technique, and it really doesn't take much longer than doing just one. So with that card assembled, I have one more cat silhouette that I'm going to glue in front of this tag. And it works out absolutely perfect that this embossing folder creates 3 of these pieces, and that kitty cat's die cuts 3 different cat silhouettes. So I'm pulling out the berry gems again. This time, instead of using them in the sky, I'm using them in the center of the flower. The little stamen inside the flower look kind of like those little gems, so I'm just putting a few of them on there. I did a larger one in the center, and then I'm putting some of the smaller ones around it. Just a different way of using those gems. You can use them for whatever you want, and a lot of people use them to just kind of scatter around their focal element. Sometimes, depending on the image, I like to use them in the actual image. So this works perfect to put them in the center of that flower. It adds some beautiful sparkle as well as another little focal element as well as that cat. So I'm going to take my Crop-A-Dial and put the holes that are in the front of that tag throughout the rest of that tag. And I'm just using a silver cord to loop through there and tie a bow. Now you can use whatever you want. You could even use some thin ribbon here. I didn't want to take any attention away from the element on the tag, so I just thought a silver cord was nice and simple and thin and not heavy looking. So I just did a bow here, but you can do however you want. And here is the finished result. I absolutely love the shimmer that you get from those interference inks. And I know those colors tone down a little bit as they sit, but I really love that you get a hint of each one of those colors. So for my second set, I'm using the Mushrooms from Me to You 3D embossing folder, and I'm starting out exactly the same way as I started out the floral one. So I have my mixed media heavy stock. I misted it lightly on both sides, put it in my embossing folder, and then putting it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. I like to put it back and forth a couple times to really press the paper into all of those nooks and crannies. And then I'm going to take it out of that embossing folder and let it sit and dry for a few minutes. Because that paper is damp, I don't want to start adding ink to it and risk that it might start seeping and bleeding. So by letting it completely dry, I can make sure that that ink is going to go exactly where I want it to. So I did my backgrounds exactly the same way as I did for the first set. I used that white pigment ink, put it on my flat side of my embossing folder, folded them, put it through the embossing machine, and repeated that step several times to build up that white ink. Then I'm using my embossing tool to heat set that ink. Like I said before, you want to make sure to do it longer than you think to make sure that that ink is completely set. If it's not totally set, when you go to do your ink blending with the next colors on top, you're going to start to rehydrate that ink and blend it a little bit. Not so bad if you do, but you don't want to contaminate your ink pads. So definitely make sure to heat set till that ink is completely set. So off camera, I also washed all of that pigment ink off of my embossing folder. It just rinses off with water. You don't need any special cleaner to clean it off. And then I completely dried my embossing folder as well. I matched up the embossed image with my embossing folder, and I'm taping that in place for my next steps. Now, this technique is mainly for people that don't necessarily have interference ink pads and don't necessarily want them. This is an alternative way of getting that ink in the background. So I have some distress ink here in 4 different colors. I have Twisted Citron, Mustard Seed, Picked Raspberry, and Salty Ocean. And I'm just putting some of that color on my embossing folder where I want it to go. And then I'm taking an ink blending tool and just ink blending the edges out. I just don't want any harsh edges here. And I'm going to close that folder, put it through my Platinum 6 machine, and then I'm going to open that up, and if I have enough ink on there, I'm going to work on the next color. If not, I can add a little bit more of that ink color, and I'm going to work through all of the colors, making sure to use that ink blending tool to blend out those edges. I don't want any harsh edges or any harsh lines. Don't necessarily have to make sure that that ink stays on the raised surface, because if anything goes into the recesses of that embossing folder, it's just going to go on the black cardstock. Because this dye ink is transparent, you're not going to see it on that cardstock. With the green done how I like, I can start working on my yellow. Now these are distress inks here. You can use any dye ink here that will work. You could even use some oxide inks if you wanted to on here. I just chose the distress inks because I like the vibrancy of it, but keep in mind as this dries, it's going to blend in with that pigment ink and it's going to be a little bit duller, a little bit chalkier. So you're going to lose some of that vibrancy as it sits, just like I did with that interference ink. But I love the fact that you get some color in that background. And I also love the look of one color bleeding into the next on that background. Now, just because I'm using color on these backgrounds doesn't mean you have to. You could use these ink or these embossing folders or any embossing folder with this technique with the white pigment ink and then just leave it at that. Having that black and white background, I think looks great as well. Because I wanted to put that cat silhouette die shape on there, I wanted to have a little bit more color on that background so that that die cut silhouette on the front would show up a little bit more. I think if I just had the background black and white and then put a black die cut on there, it wouldn't have the same impact that it does with the color. So now that I have my background the way that I want it, I can put my dies in place and I can cut it. Before I do that though, I do want to take that excess ink off of my embossing folder and have a nice clean surface to put my dies on. I just don't want to get ink all over my dies, forget to wipe them off, and then end up getting ink on a future project. So once I have those dies in place, I can close my folder, put it through my machine, and it will cut all of those pieces there. Now I can tell that my dye ink is wet on top of that pigment ink. So I'm going to take my heat tool and I'm going to heat set it as well. And you'll see as I heat set it that ink dries, and it just dries into the pigment ink below it. So once those pieces were heat set, I put everything aside and I took out my scallop labels and tags die set and I cut layers for these pieces. Just like the last one, I just did black and white layers, but the last one I used my interference ink pads to color those layers. For these ones, I'm just going to leave them black and white and have the only color on that 3D embossed image. Now I cut my layers a little bit closer to the sizes for the Mushrooms from Me to You embossed images. So you're not going to see a ton of that white mat. It's just going to be a little sliver around it. If you want your mat to be a little bit more prominent, you could choose the next sizes up so that you see more of it. Again, I wanted the focal point to be on that 3D embossed image in the center, and a little sliver around the outside edges was perfect enough for this. I didn't want to take away from that. I have another set of those kitty cat die cuts that I'm going to add to these cards. Once again, I love the look of that black silhouette in front of the colored background. Again, I left my cards themselves fairly plain compared to the last set of cards that I created using different techniques with these 3D embossing folders. And I'm going to link that video at the end of this one. It has so many more different techniques that you can use with this set. So this set is very versatile and there's some great ways to get some different looks out of it. I absolutely love this set because of its uniqueness and because it die cuts these unique shapes with these different pictures in it. I just kind of fell in love with it and love the different looks that you can get using different techniques. So once again, I'm gluing everything together with that Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle so I can glue both the bigger backgrounds as well as the smaller die cuts with it. And then I like to put an acrylic block on there to hold everything down in place while it's drying, freeing up my hands for other things. Once again, for the tag, I created different layers and then did a second layer of my largest size. I took my score pal, scored along the top of that so I can glue just that top piece and have a tag that opens up to add a little message. Then I can glue my other layers on there and then finally glue on that little tag embossed image. And then of course we need to add the cat die cut. Once again, I just mixed and matched the different cats that I wanted for my different layers. But if you have a favorite, you can just cut multiple of that particular one. I like the different looks with the different silhouettes on there. For this particular one, rather than using those gems as stars in the skies, I decided to use some stickles. So I'm just using dots of stickles in the sky. You could also use a white gel pen. The one thing though with the white gel pen, it's going to rehydrate that distress ink underneath it. And chances are it's going to end up being colored by that distress ink. So it might not be bright white, which is why I chose to do the stickles. I can make little dots of whatever size I want and let them completely dry. It's going to let any of the ink underneath show through and just be shimmery, glittery dots once I'm done. You could also use a shimmer gel pen here. I think that would look really pretty as well. So there is the final result. And I love the look of, or the subtle look of those stars in the sky there with that stickles. These embossing folders, like I said before, are so much fun to play with. I love the detail and dimension that they have. And by adding different colors and using them with the interference ink, you can create some really incredible looks. Thank you so much for joining me and spending your time with me today. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope you have a fantastic day.